Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. In episode 31, we learned that Bristol, in the years 1919-1927, served as the commander of the U.S. Naval Detachment in Turkish waters and as the U.S. High Commissioner to Turkey. In this capacity, he witnessed firsthand the Turkish War of Independence, the formation of the First Turkish Republic, and the early years of its existence. His papers, consisting of some 33,000 items, include reports, diaries, correspondence, copies of official dispatches, telegrams, and appointment sheets covering his entire career. The papers reflecting his tenure in Turkey from 1919 to 1927 reveal in detail the character of political, military, social, and economic conditions in Anatolia during the turbulent period of post-World War I era. Bristol's intellectual correspondence, mostly based on formidable documents that he gathered, is often cited during discussions on numerous events of the time. He is known to be objective, accurate, honest, and fair, like an honorable soldier and a commander should be. So why do the Armenians hate him? And why do the Armenian-financed genocide scholars deliberately ignore his writings? Could it be because Bristol played a significant role in his opposition to Armenian fantasies of establishing an apartheid on Turkish soil under the cover of an American mandate? And to what extent have the contents of the Bristol papers been utilized by scholars dealing with Turkish-Armenian conflict between 1919 and 1921? To answer this question, let me describe one event. The Turkish occupation of the city of Kars on October 30th, 1920, and the subsequent fate of the Armenian residents of this northeastern Anatolian city, based on the findings of Dr. Heath Laurie. Typical of the works published in the last decade, which include an account of the fall of Kars to the Turkish nationalist forces under the command of Kazım Karabekir Pasha, are Christopher J. Walker's Armenia, The Survival of a Nation, and Dikran Boyajian's Armenia, The Case for a Forgotten Genocide. Of the two, Walker provides by far the greater detail, quoting at length from Armenian accounts, including those of Simon Vratsian, formed Prime Minister of the Armenian Republic. Minister A. Beblian, an eyewitness, and a contemporary report taken from the Baku Armenian language newspaper, Communist. These three sources are unanimous in their descriptions of the massacres perpetrated by the Turkish soldiers in the wake of their occupation of Kars. Thus, Vratsian reports, I quote, "For 3 days, uninterruptedly, the Turks looted, raped, and killed, and perpetrated every kind of savagery in the city," unquote. In a similar vein, Beblian, in the words of Walker, I quote, describes with terrifying colors the cruelties done by the Turks. The Armenians were subject to slaughter, beautiful women were taken into concubinage, able-bodied men were driven away into the interior of Turkey, unquote. Finally, the account in the Communist newspaper provides the following details, I quote, "But the troops which entered the city spared neither women, children, nor the aged. For 5 days, these bloodthirsty soldiers and the Kurds perpetrated upon the head of the peaceful population atrocities which were beyond the imagination of men. Armenians alone, they killed. In Kars alone, 6,000 Armenians fell victim to Turkish brutality. Mass arrests of Armenians followed the terrible massacre. They stripped them from head to foot, and in hundreds they dispatched them to work in Erzurum and Sarıkamış. Those sent were struck down by cold and died from hunger and suffering, unquote. Boyajian's comments are limited to and consist of two laconic statements, unquote. Soon the fortress of Kars fell, and I quote, atrocities continued in localities which remained in Turkish hands. It has been reliably reported that in Kars alone, more than 10,000 Armenians were killed, unquote. From these two modern secondary accounts, the reader is left with the clear impression that the Turkish occupation of Kars was accompanied by widespread looting on the part of the Turkish soldiers and the massacre of between 6,000 to 10,000 Armenian residents of the city. Walker and Boyajian's accounts, while supporting one another in terms of content, also share another similarity. This is their failure to utilize any non-Armenian accounts of the fall of Kars and its aftermath. Indeed, the reader whose knowledge of this event derived from these two works would be unaware that there were some 20 American Near East relief workers resident in Kars on October 30th, 1920, or that the commanding general of the Turkish nationalist forces who conquered the city, Kazım Karabekir, has left a detailed account of the city's occupation in his autobiography. As one might expect, Karabekir's account of the fall of Kars centers on the military orders he issued as commander of the Turkish forces prior to its conquest. However, he does provide the following passage relating to the aftermath of its occupation. I quote, by late evening, October 30th, 1920, the following prisoners had been brought to my headquarters in this station: 3 generals, 6 colonels, 12 majors, 16 captains, 59 lieutenants, 16 civilian officials, 12 officers, and 4 cadets. There were also 1,150 soldiers taken prisoner. The number of confirmed Armenian dead was 1,100. Among the captured supplies were 337 usable cannons, 339 cannons which needed repair, many machine guns, all kinds of bullets, ammunition, etc. Among the prisoners were Aratov, the Minister of War, Velilov, the Chief of General Staff, Primov, the commander of the Kars fortress, and a civilian officer. This victory, which I gained by a counteroffensive, was a great success. And despite the fact that we destroyed a large part of the enemy army and conquered a modern fortress, we suffered few casualties, 9 dead and 47 wounded. In my order to attack Kars, I had stated the following, I quote, the goal of this offensive is to destroy the principal Armenian forces within Kars, or to drive them out of Kars. As a matter of fact, my soldiers proved that they were a disciplined, powerful modern army, and that they possessed remarkable humane feelings. Despite the fact that they had successfully attacked a modern fortress such as Kars, they did not commit the slightest harm against the city's civilian Armenian population, unquote. This fact was witnessed by the American delegation resident there. And in a telegram they dispatched to Admiral Bristol on October 31st, they wrote, I quote, all the Americans in Kars are well, and the Turkish army is full of concern for us, and accords us all considerations. We have been given permission to continue our activities as before. The Turkish soldiers are well disciplined and there have been no massacres, unquote. Edward Fox, District Commander, Near East Relief, Kars. This American delegation in Kars, which announced to the world the courage and restraint possessed by the Turkish army and the compassion it expressed towards the Armenian children, had the responsibility of caring for 6,000 poor and orphaned children. Karabekir's description of the aftermath of the city's occupation continues with a declaration which he published in Russian, Armenian, and Turkish on November 1st, 1920. This document, entitled "To the Armenian People," guarantees the security of the civilian population who cooperate with the Turkish forces. At the same time, it assures the population that anyone apprehended providing protection and shelter to spies and traitors will immediately be executed in the name of the public order. The obvious discrepancies between the Walker-Boyajian account and that provided by Kazım Karabekir are illustrative of the type of problem facing the student of Turkish-Armenian relations. Graphically conflicting versions of the same events as seen from the perspective of two protagonists. All too often, the student of history, whose aim is objectivity, is forced into choosing one side or the other's uncorroborated version as fact. As regards the fall of Kars, we are fortunate in having the testimony of some 20 American neutrals who were stationed in the city on October 30th, 1920. In the employ of the Near East Relief, these Americans were charged with providing care for several thousand Armenian war orphans in the city. They kept in close contact with Admiral Bristol and his intelligence officers. The reports they provided the Admiral, relevant to the fall of Kars and its aftermath, together with copies of his own communications sent to Washington, are all preserved in the Library of Congress Bristol Papers collection. An examination of this material serves two purposes. A, it provides us with an additional scale against which to weight the conflicting Walker-Boyajian and Karabekir accounts of the city's conquest, and B, it allows us to analyze Richard Hovhannissian's oft-repeated charge that Bristol was a master of manipulation who selected excerpts from reports which would sustain his contentions even in the face of strong counter-evidence, unquote. The earliest reference by Bristol to the fall of Kars is contained in his report of the operations for the week ending November 7th, 1920. He wrote, I quote, "A telegram was received from Kars through the Italian military authorities in Anatolia, stating that our Americans were safe and going ahead with their work and not being molested by the Turks. Also, that there were no massacres and our relief workers are permitted to take care of the orphans as usual," unquote. The original copy of this telegram sent to Bristol by Edward Fox from Kars is also preserved, and its wording is identical to that provided by Kazım Karabekir in his autobiography. 2 weeks later, on November 15, 1920, the same Edward Fox, commander of the Near East Relief Group in Kars, submitted a 28-point typewritten memorandum on the fall of Kars to Bristol. This, the most detailed of the eyewitness accounts, gives us an hour-by-hour account of the events of October 30th and thereafter. Fox's first-hand observations on the city's conquest include the following in regard to Armenian casualties. I quote, "By this time, the bullets were flying thick and fast. The soldiers, the Armenian soldiers, from the forts were pouring down into the valley road, and Armenian cavalrymen led their horses at a run down the steep flights of the stone steps, leaving from the forts. The Turkish soldiers standing on the heights fired at the retreating Armenian troops, who took refuge among the women and children of the road. And this resulted in the death of many non-combatants. Considering the jam on the road, it is remarkable that many more were not killed. I roughly estimate the dead in the valley to number 50." Unquote. There were no massacres. On December 15, 1920, Bristol had a visit from Edward Fox, who provided him with additional details on the situation in Kars. In Bristol War Diary, for this date, the following summary of his conversation with Fox is given. "The Turks marched into Kars, and the Armenians ran away without firing a shot, except from 2 or 3 places on the hill in the beginning. And this firing soon ceased. Many of the Armenians threw away their guns, stripped off their uniforms, and hid in the houses, especially in the nearest relief orphanages and hospitals with children. The Turks were very badly clothed, and therefore every Armenian soldier they captured, they stripped and took their clothes for themselves. There were no massacres, except certain Armenians were killed, and this was reported to be for crimes Armenians committed." Unquote. Bristol's report on operations for the week of December 15, 1920, contains the first detailed description of the fall of Kars, which he forwarded to Washington. A comparison of its text with the Fox reports cited above clearly establishes Bristol's heavy reliance upon the eyewitness descriptions proved to him by the Near East relief personnel in Kars. I quote, "The Turkish forces were far inferior to the Armenians, but the latter put up no fight and ran away in the most cowardly manner. The soldiers, the Armenian soldiers, threw away their guns, stripped off their equipment, and hid in the hospitals and orphanages belonging to the Near East Relief Committee when the Turks entered Kars. There was hardly a shot fired from the Kars fortifications, and there were no troops to withstand the advance of the Turks, who marched in as if on parade. The Armenian soldiers, in many cases, hid in the beds with sick children. The Turks, in their advance into Armenia, did not do any massacring, but did, after the occupation of Kars, execute a few Armenians." Unquote. All the Armenians, both civil and military, ran. They robbed and plundered first what they could. Armenian soldiers hid under the children's beds. Nor were Bristol's sources of information limited to reports submitted to his office by missionaries and Near East relief personnel. He also had his own intelligence officers, one of whom, Robert C. Dunn, visited Kars early in December of 1920. His observations were written up in a 14-page typed document entitled Historical Summary of Military and Other Events, and submitted to the Admiral on December 25, 1920. This section of Dunn's report, dealing with the fall of Kars, was based on extensive interviews he held with Near East relief personnel in the city. Among the additional details provided by Dunn, the following are of particular interest in regard to the aftermath of the conquest. I quote, "All the Armenians, both civil and military, ran. crowding into the narrow river gorge which runs between the forts and where the NER headquarters is situated. They robbed and plundered first what they could. NER Armenian workers were as bad at this as anyone, stealing blankets and what else they could from the orphanages. For an hour or so, the gorge was a scene of chaos. Armenian soldiers hid under the children's beds in the institutions. The Turks, appearing on the heights, fired indiscriminately into the crowds in the valley below. Just what Armenian generals committed suicide is hard to find out. Mizimanov certainly did. Piramov was cut off, surrounded, and taken prisoner. There is doubt whether my Sarıkamış friend, Merimanov, committed suicide or was killed. Some of the few officers who did not run shot their men for doing so. When the valley was crowded with military and entire civil population of the town, the 3 days looting that followed was not organized and was done as much by Armenian refugees as by Turkish soldiers. A good deal of NER stuff was taken, but the Turks subjected the Americans to few inconveniences and demands. Apparently, all the Americans kept their heads and did the right thing, kept their nerve too. And it was owing to the example to the Turks that worse looting and perhaps massacre did not occur. It was during Atov's expedition to Darjur that Armenian civilians fired on Turkish regulars, and the population of 2 villages near Hamamlı were massacred. The Turks are quite frank about this, and the Armenians had no convincing comeback, unquote. The Bristol papers also contain a copy of a letter from Veronica Harris, a member of the NER staff, in Kars, which she sent to the Admiral on February 17, 1921. This communication provides a detailed analysis of the relations between the NER personnel and the nationalist Turkish forces commanded by Kazım Karabekir Pasha. In regard to the treatment of NER Armenian employees, Harris informs Admiral Bristol that, I quote, "The Turks have arrested about 60, all told, of our men here, which is about 1/10 of our employees. They have released some 13 or 14 of our most necessary employees. We have had much trouble through the Armenians, either from spite or to curry favor with the Turks, informing on their own people and manufacturing an evidence themselves. The Turks have apparently not flagrantly ill-treated the men they take, and so far we have not heard of any executions," unquote. The information I presented today came from Dr. Heath Laurie's meticulous research called American Observers in Anatolia, circa 1920. The Bristol Papers. Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and Modern Turkey, 1912-1926, Bosphorus University, Istanbul, 1984, pages 42 to 58. In summation, Laurie tried to convey the tone of the contents of the Bristol Papers and of Bristol the man via a focused examination of one event they cover, the Ottoman occupation of Kars and its aftermath. To the degree that Laurie has succeeded, this analysis will have furnished the viewer with 2 clear impressions. First, an appreciation of Admiral Bristol's as a man well in tune with events in Anatolia, who made full utilization of the wide variety of information sources at his disposal. Second, an awareness of the potential dangers involved in subscribing to any purported description of events in Anatolia between 1919 and 1920, which is not based in part on the wealth of material contained in the Bristol papers. Will this information now finally compel the Armenian-financed genocide scholars to change their biased thinking? Will Armenia open its archives now to dispassionate scholarship? Please join me next week to find out. Thank you and see you next week.